Good morning and welcome to our Bible class this morning for Sunday, May 17th, 2020. We're thankful that you've joined us because today we're beginning a new series in which we'll be looking at the parables of Jesus. So if you'd like to, go ahead and open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 13, and that's, of course, the parable of the sower or the parable of the soils, and that's going to be our focus this morning for the beginning of this new study. The word parable actually first appears in the New Testament here in Matthew 13, so that makes it a good place for us to begin this study together this morning. As you know, parables actually appear in both the Old and New Testaments, but if you're like me, when you hear the word parable, you probably immediately think to the parables of Jesus, and that's because it's been estimated that about a third of all of Jesus' teachings were through that medium of parables. Of course, most of those parables are recorded in Matthew and Luke. Mark he records a few of them, and actually none of them are in the book of John. But let's think about what is a parable. Of course, the definition that we've probably all been taught is that it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, and that's a wonderful definition. You should continue to remember that. But literally, you might describe a parable as to mean to cast alongside. You might even, in your mind, put the idea of comparing two objects, sitting them side by side for the purpose of comparison, and that would be a good definition as well of a parable. Or think about in terms of the preacher preaching. When he preaches and presents some teaching to you, generally he will also lay beside that preaching an illustration that helps us to understand the teaching better. And so that's the idea here in a parable. It's an illustration that helps us to understand the teaching just a little bit better. It's also important for us to remember as we're studying parables that sometimes the parables are fictitious stories. But remember that they are true to life stories. They're things that really can happen. So when we read through the Bible, we're not going to read of Jesus preaching about a cow jumping over the moon, because a cow cannot jump over the moon. But it's good to keep those things in mind as we enter into our study about the parables of Jesus. Go ahead and look in your Bibles at Matthew chapter 13 and verses 1 through 9. In this first section of this parable, again, the parable of the sower, sometimes I think it could really be better named the parable of the soils, because I believe that's more the main focus of the parable, but there's an interesting setting for this sermon. Jesus has been in Capernaum, and he's come out to the Sea of Galilee, but also a huge crowd of people have come out to hear what he has to say. So as a result of that, he stepped into a boat, and he's actually in the boat on the Sea of Galilee, that boat serving as his pulpit, preaching there to this crowd of people on the beach. And so that's what I want us to notice this morning as we read. Let's read together from Matthew 13, verses 3 through 8. And he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. Notice what Jesus is presenting here, and he shows us four different types of soils in which the seed of the sower might land. And the first one he mentions in verse 4 is the path, or what we would usually call the wayside soil. This was very hard ground. Imagine ground that's been packed down so much, because that's the path that people have been walking on day after day after day. So when the seed gets thrown on that soil, it's so hard that it can't really sink down into the soil, and as a result, the birds come and eat it and it's taken away. Maybe a modern day illustration, I would describe this as that little stretch of grass at the front of my lawn that connects to the road, that little section of grass in between the mailbox and the road, where the mailman rides over it for some reason every single day, even though I don't want him to, but he's driven through it so much that there's just that little path that it's so hard and packed down. Here we are in spring. We've all weeded and we've feeded and we've overseeded, and you've got new grass growing up everywhere except for that path, that wayside soil that the mailman drives over every single day. Then the second type of soil that he gives us is in verses 5 and 6. That's the rocky soil or the stony soil. If you can imagine, a layer of soil that's actually resting on top of a shelf, of a rocky shelf. So what that prevents is the most important part, which is those roots. The roots cannot grow deep, and the roots are what suck up water and nutrients out of the soil. But that rocky shelf is preventing that. So what happens is the plant or the grass, it shoots up, but then the sun comes up and scorches it just as quickly as the grass grew. So that's not a good soil for the seed of the sower either. In verse 7, he talks about the thorny soil. We might call that the weedy soil. It seems to be fertile soil, and in fact, it seems to be a little too fertile, because it seems like anything and everything can grow there. The good stuff, the bad stuff, the grass, as well as the weeds, the thorns. And what happens when they're all growing together, we want to get those weeds out of the grass, but those weeds seem to choke out the good grass and prevent it from growing as it should. Then, of course, finally, the last one that he mentions in verse 8 is the good soil. That's the one we want. That's that fertile soil, the soil that is weed-free, and that's the target spot for the seeds of the sower. But notice the second section of this parable. In verses 10 through 17, it's interesting, right in the middle of the parable and the explanation to the parable, he sort of takes a little pause because his disciples are asking him, well, why are you all of a sudden teaching in parables? And that's pretty interesting, because here we are in Matthew 13, and he's begun to preach in parable. His earthly ministry began in chapter 4, and so you've got nearly 10 chapters of fairly straightforward teaching from Jesus. And now all of a sudden, he's preaching in parables. So his disciples are asking, why are you preaching to them in parables? Let's notice what he says in response in verses 10 through 17. Then the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? And he answered them, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, you will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it. So what Jesus has said in these verses is he's given us two purposes for the parables. And it almost seems like they're contradictory. But keep in mind that he's got a crowd of people that are different types of people. He says the first thing that he's trying to do is to conceal the truth. Because what's happened is, I mentioned he had about 10 chapters of straightforward teaching, and now all of a sudden he's teaching in parables. Around about chapter 12, Jesus began to receive a whole lot more attention than maybe he wanted. He started to receive a lot more criticism and scrutiny than he wanted. In chapter 12, his disciples, they pluck the heads of grain and eat them, and they get criticized for it. He heals a man's withered hand. He cast out a demon from a demon-possessed man. And he gets criticized for all of that. We don't read about them being amazed by a withered hand being restored. Only we read about the criticism that he received. So you've got a mixture of people. You've got sensitive hearts, and then you've got hardened hearts in this crowd. So to a portion of them, it seems that he's saying he wants to conceal truth from those who are prejudiced against it, from those who are so hard-hearted that they're not even going to listen to what's being said. They're just going to reject it. So by preaching in this parable, it's almost an act of the mercy of God, in that what Jesus wants to do is he wants to bring his critics closer to him, not push them further away. So by preaching in a parable, rather than them just, again, hardening their hearts further and resulting in a position even further away from God, they're going to leave this place thinking, well, I guess he was just preaching about farming today, rather than rejecting and being further away from God. But at the same time, he wants to reveal truth. So the other part of this section we just read, he's talking about people with sensitive, good-seeking hearts. Folks who are seeking truth, those who are seeking God, they're going to be able to see. He talks in verse 9 about if you have those who have ears, let them hear. And that's more than just a, hey, you guys listen up type of statement. Verse 16, blessed are those with eyes to see and ears to hear. He's talking about the perceptiveness that comes with those who are seeking truth. They're going to be able to listen and to understand that this parable is an illustration of an even greater truth that they need to understand. Notice with me now the final section of this parable, and that's the explanation of it in verses 18 through 23. This is probably, of course, this is a great parable for us to begin this series with, because it's one of those in which Jesus actually gives us the explanation, so it's much more easy for us to understand. But it's also possibly your favorite parable because of that same reason, because he gives us the explanation. But let's notice what he has to say in these verses about the hearts of man, about the hearts of those who hear the gospel. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit. So he's presented 4 types of hearts here. This parable is an illustration of 4 types of hearts of the hearers of the gospel. The first one, of course, is that path, the wayside soil. Remember, it's so hard and so packed down that it almost seems like the seeds bounce off of it and it's quickly taken away by the birds. It almost seems like with a person with this type of a heart, the word sort of bounces off of them and is quickly taken away. The second one is the rocky soil. Remember that soil that had that rocky shelf underneath it so that no roots could grow? This person seems to hear the gospel and to receive it, but doesn't continue to grow roots very deep. This is the person who sort of thinks it's a one and done type of situation. Well, I'm saved now, nothing more for me to do. But there's a whole lot more for us to do in order to grow. So when difficult times come on account of that faith, this person, as a result, doesn't have any roots to lean upon, and therefore sort of says, well, it's easier for me to just give up this faith, and therefore they depart as a result. The third one is the thorny soil, or the thorny, weedy type of heart. Remember, this is the one that he seems to just be enthusiastic about everything. Remember, weeds and grass can grow in this soil. This person seems to be enthusiastic about the word, but he's also enthusiastic about the riches and all of the cares of the world. And so as a result of that, the riches, you can't serve two masters. You're either going to serve one and hate the other. And so that seems to be what happens with this type of a heart. In the world, the cares of this world seem to choke out the Word from our lives. So there's a choice that has to be made there. But then the final one is the good soil, those good, sensitive, seeking hearts that hear the Word and receive it. They grow roots that dig deep, and they end up producing fruit for God. And that's the target of the seeds of the sower. And so that's the target type of heart that we're looking for when we seek to share the gospel as well. And that's the type of heart that we want to have as well. I want you to notice as we conclude one neat thing about parables. One of the neat things about the parables is that they seem to teach one main point. It makes it easier for us to understand. It's not a situation where we have to look at every single detail and try to connect it to some even greater purpose or explanation. But generally, the whole story works together to teach one main point. And the main focus of this parable of the sower, the parable of the soils, is the heart of man. What type of heart are we going to have? Am I going to have that hard heart that the Word just bounces off of? Am I going to stop at conversion and not grow any roots? Am I going to allow the world to coexist with the Word in my heart? Or am I going to be that type of good soil that receives the Word, digs deep, and produces fruit for the Lord? Thank you for being with us for the beginning of our series on the parables of Jesus.